Boa noite a todos e todos. É um enorme prazer abrir esse ciclo de palestras da Fundação Getulio Vargas. Meu nome é Eric Klug, eu sou presidente da Japan House São Paulo. A Japan House é uma iniciativa do governo japonês, estabelecida em 2017, que recebe milhões de pessoas para suas exposições. Temos duas no momento, a exposição Daisy Balloon e a exposição da artista japonesa Yuko Mori, e uma infinidade de eventos online e híbridos, incluindo, por exemplo, as nossas exposições virtuais, todas acessíveis no nosso site, eventos como o nosso clube de leitura e as nossas online trip. Então fiquem, por favor, convidados a visitar presencialmente, digitalmente a Japan House e usá-la como uma ponte entre o Brasil e o Japão. Nós investimos muito nos nossos recursos de acessibilidade, tanto física quanto digital, para tornar essa experiência o mais ampla possível e mais prazerosa. Muito obrigado.
Welcome to the second edition of the lecture discussing multilateral security and regionalism in East Asia as part of a new round of webinars organized by the Japan House São Paulo in collaboration with the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas. We are thrilled to welcome back Professor Dr. Isabela Nogueira de Moraes from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, as well as Professor Dr. Ken Jimbo from the University of Keio in Tokyo. This is in the second session, we are swapping the roles, so the talk will be led by Professor Dr. Isabela, and Professor Jimbo will give us his comments and open the debate afterwards. Now, the coordinator of this initiative, Professor Dr. Pedro Brites, would like to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Luana. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is well and safe. It is a great pleasure to start the second webinar on Asian international relations. On behalf of the School of International Relations at FGV, it is a great pleasure to be able to host this series of such important debates on international politics. Especially, we are honored to welcome again Professor Isabela Nogueira and Professor Ken Jimbo. I want to thank you both immensely for having accepted our invitation. I'm sure it will be a great night of reflection and debate. I also would like to thank Japan House São Paulo for the partnership and the support in this event. So I wish you all a great event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pedro. I now invite Mr. Carlos Rosa, Vice President of the Japan House São Paulo, to join us in the opening remarks.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure for us at Japan House São Paulo to be part of this initiative. As Eric mentioned during the video, we are here to show the best of Japan, the Japan of the modern Japan, the Japan of the 21st century. For us, it's a pleasure. I would like to thank you very much, Professor Dr. Ken Jimbo, Professor Dr. Isabela Nogueira, the good friends of Getulio Vargas, which are with us for a long period, Professor Pedro, Luana from the Department of International Relations. I think that's the second year that we are making these events together, and it's a pleasure for us to participate. Today we will talk about the international relations of Asia, multilateral security and regionalism, and it will be a pleasure to be here with you and to watch Professor Jimbo and Professor Isabela. That for sure will bring us very interesting speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosa. As usual, we must disclaim that all statements expressed during this event represent only personal opinions and not necessarily the institutional position of Fundação Getulio Vargas. Also, all present here have agreed to participate and have consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be later posted on FGV's official channels. The audience can and is encouraged to send us questions during the entire duration of the event through the Slido platform, which can be accessed in the event description on YouTube. During the last part of the webinar, some questions will be brought up to the professors. And without further ado, we will proceed to the lecture of Professor Nogueira and then comments from Professor Jimbo. The lecturer of the night is Dr. Isabela Nogueira, professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where she collaborates with the Economics Institute, the postgraduate program on international political economy, while also coordinating Lab China on Chinese political economy studies She has taught and has conducted her postdoc at the University of Geneva and was visiting professor in Helsinki, Beijing, and Maputo, besides being awarded various national and international scholarships. Professor Nogueira, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here once again with Professor Ken Jimbo, with with Carlos Rosa, with Pedro, with Luana. Thank you very much for this invitation from FGV, and also thank you very much from this invitation from the Japan House. I think it's a very innovative format and a very provocative format, because I had the chance last 2 weeks ago, right, to listen to Professor Ken Jimbo and to really exchange with him. It was a lecture that I learned a lot from, and now we have the opposite position. So I really find it a very interesting and provocative format. So thank you for making this floor possible. So I will start by sharing my presentation with you. Oops, there we are. I hope you can see it fine.
Yes.
So, okay, wonderful. So we will still, of course, be inside East Asia and still focus international relations in Asia, but I will put my lenses on, which is my specialty, which is the political economy of China's development, and try to ask some questions about what are the recent changes that we have been seeing in China's development model after Xi Jinping in 2014, and actually more recently, what type of changes have we seen in China's development model since the post-COVID, and how does it affect international relations order in more general ways? So my regard and my questions are related to the fact that, well, we all know that China went from post-COVID quite well. It was one of the very few economies that grew last year. It grew 2.3%, while if we take the European Union, it had a contraction of 6.2%, Latin America minus 6.3%, OECD members minus 4.7%, the US economy minus 3.5%. So clearly, we had an economy that was sort of getting out of COVID, getting out of the pandemic in a good shape, right? The same happened in the first semester of this year. Nevertheless, in the second semester, we started to see some quite confusing signs coming from Chinese economy. First, actually, the crackdown on internet happened first. So first, we had a crackdown on big internet platforms. Some people call it a crackdown on big techs. Actually, it's not in big techs generally, but it focuses mostly on internet platforms and more recently on tutoring, basically sometimes some specific forms of education or private education in China. Then we had Evergrande crisis, which seemed to be a real sector impact quite big for China's economy. More recently, power shortages, and all that coming with lower growth, right? Growth is low to 4.9% in the third quarter from 7.9% in the previous one, and forecast for this year is a growth around 7 to 8% and 4% in 2022. It's not drastic. We're not talking about a drastic slowdown or something that would put other economies, right, many economies would be happy to have any type of growth like that. But what is calling our attention at this time is that Chinese leadership, they don't seem to be reacting in terms of counter-cyclical measures, right? We don't seem to have any type of slower growth is not a problem anymore, right? So to which extent, a couple of questions arise from that, like to which extent are these structural fragilities of Chinese economies, or are we heading towards some type of structural changes that are going on, or actually both things maybe are happening? So what type of changes does this imply? Before I answer that, I want to put this the changes in China's landscape into a bigger picture, how the current Chinese development model is tied with geopolitical imperatives, right? In the sense of what are we facing when we look at China's position in the world nowadays, and especially China-US disputes. If we look at the most recent cover from Foreign Affairs, which was released last week, actually, we will see this narrative around a new Cold War quite emphatically, right? We have an article in this The Divided World, America's Cold Wars. We have an article from Mearsheimer, who is a major realist, international relations specialist in the US, saying that engagement with China was a colossal mistake. I quote him, right? He's saying that from the beginning, from the 80s, 90s, 2000, it was a mistake to give China most favored nation status and so forth. And therefore, he goes forward on this narrative of a new Cold War. On my view, this idea that we can find in several media that we're facing a new Cold War is a big anachronism for several reasons, right? Commercial and productive links between China and the US, very straight. Pressure from American business recently has also been quite strong in the sense of trying to cool down the levels of tensions between the two nations and trying to cool down the pressures that the US government's doing towards China. We saw a visit, a former of Goldman Sachs recently coming to China, and he was received like a state person. And all intercapitalist connections and competitions therefore make this term a big anachronism, right? We're not seeing a confrontation between blocs or different production modes, but between powers, right? So therefore, the next question comes then, are we facing a hegemonic transition then? If it's not a new Cold War, then can we talk about a hegemonic transition? I would argue that it's quite early to say that. In technology, we can say that China is approaching the US, yes, although we do have strong gaps in terms of chips and semiconductors, but nevertheless, in military power, in monetary, especially if you consider the power of the dollar shaping the international monetary system, and in terms of soft power, the distance is quite great. Although recently we got the news that China has tested a hypersonic weapon, which can carry a nuclear weapon on it, although it has denied, but still it changes the balance of power in the region, in Indo-Pacific, but in also China-US relations. But still, it seems quite premature to talk about hegemonic transition. So can we talk about changes in the global regime of capitalist accumulation? So that's the path I'm taking, actually. Yes, I would argue that yes. After we had for 30, 40 years an experience of welfare Keynesianism all over the world that was quite hegemonic in terms of governing our international political economy from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Then we went to the 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010s to a financialized neoliberalism. And now we're facing what type of changes are we seeing in our international political economy environment? We cannot answer that precisely yet because changes are starting right now and the new framework's not into shape yet. But what we can say is that we are facing a strong technological transition. What some people call it an industry 4.0, right? A 4.0 revolution. So in economic history, we usually say that the first revolution started in England in the end of the 18th century, especially with steam engine. And then the second industrial revolution was based on electrical and chemical energy and goes until the end of the Second World War. The third one, many sectors in Brazil haven't gone still through the third industrial revolutions, but it's concentrated on semiconductors and computers. And now we would be going through the so-called fourth industrial revolution. What is it? What are we talking about? Let's talk about this radical changes in technological paradigms. Well, we were talking about so-called smart factories, right? We're supposedly going through an evolutionary leap in production organization that greatly deepens our capacity for machine-machine interaction, which means without human interaction. Basically, technologies of the fourth industrial revolutions, they are based, usually we say, on a tripod, that is telecommunications, data, and artificial intelligence. If we open that, we would say big data, Internet of Things, cyber physical system, cloud computer, 5G, and so forth, creating this possibility of machines and making decisions strategically between them without human intervention. It does have a transversal character, that is to say that it affects all productive tissue, going from cutting-edge industry to traditional activities such as textile and agriculture. So it's not something that relates exclusively with technological sectors, but also the way that we produce food, for instance, meaning that we can use artificial intelligence and satellite images to calculate what will be the next harvest, for instance, and use several machine-machine interaction mechanisms to make this harvest take place without direct human intervention and supposedly making productivity grow exponentially. It's also something that goes far beyond industry, right? You're not talking about changes. It's not a technological paradigm that stays strictly restricted to industry, but it affects everyone's life. So everything would become smart, right? We're talking about smart manufacturing, we're talking about smart cities, smart grids, smart traffic, smart homes, smart buildings, and it changes as well the ways that we make wars, right? It changes, it affects smart weapons, it affects smart military bases, and so forth. All of these technological changes, all of these industrial revolutions is supposed to be taking place along with an energy transition to a world that is coming, or that is supposed to become a low carbon world. That is to say, a transition that takes place also in the way that we produce energy, in the way that we define what are the strategic sectors and the strategic resources in this world, right? So given this backdrop, given this general backdrop, what are the current transformation according to Chinese debates, right? How does it affect the way that China faces the current changes, and how does it affect the way that it conducts its development model, right? So what's the fourth industrial revolution in China's view? Here, I took a quote from a quite important industrial policy document. It's called the IDDS, Innovation-Driven Development Strategy. It's a document that was released in 2016. It's quite a binding document in the sense that it was released and signed by both the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and by the State Council. So it's really, I would say, sort of an umbrella document under which several other industrial policy documents are subordinated to, that says that a new round of technological revolution, sectoral change, and military change is accelerating, and scientific exploration is unfolding at every scale, from the microscope to the cosmological. A group of revolutionary new technologies that are intelligent, green, and ubiquitous are reshaping the global competitive landscape and changing the relative strength of nations. That is to say, new technologies that are changing the possibilities or the hierarchy that states have in the world order. Or in using Barry Naughton's quote from his most recent paper on industrial policy, it is either the opportunity to surpass or the danger of falling further behind, right? Once again, one of these global technological shifts that open either this, I don't like this expression, this window of opportunity, right? But this moment of change in global relative powers that open either this possibility of surpassing or this danger of falling once again behind. So, I'm sorry. I lost a bit of my screen here, cannot read what's on my screen. Just a second. So how has China entered the fourth industrial revolution? We all know that China has a long history of industrial policy, but the current, I will argue that the current industrial policy is focused on an emerging technological revolution. That's what the IDDS shows us, or clearly states for us. A decade ago, Chinese industrial policy was focusing on replicating the industrial capabilities of core countries, but now catch up is no longer the case, right? The idea now China wants to lead in industries where there are no consolidated oligopolies. In that sense, this technological paradigm shift brings this opportunity, right, to enter areas in which oligopolies are not still formed. That is, for instance, the case of green energy or everything that relates to green development. Right? We saw rapid advancement of Chinese industry in that, in terms of solar panels, in terms of wind power generation, and so forth, in areas in which we didn't have so far the consolidation of certain global powers and technological powers, and in that sense, a huge advancement for Chinese industry. This is also an attempt to occupy positions of command in the current technological revolution, right? When we talk about technology, the more people using it, the more value it gets, right? So this is a strong characteristics of global value chains, right? The more people using technology, the more value it gets. That means that having a technological pattern that is used globally is also a strong sign of economic power. And in that sense, the current attempt or the current big shift that the Chinese is trying to make, the Chinese leadership are trying to make in their development model, means to turn the economy to be innovation-driven, right? What does it mean to be innovation-driven in this context? It means to take the lead in technological patterns and to have a growing number of global brands or global leading firms, which means not only anymore the made in certain place or made in China, but mostly made by China or made by Chinese firms or made by Chinese brands, right? In that sense, I also argue that China has never been an export-led economy. That is to say that the export sector has never been the driving force, the engine of growth. It has been radically important in terms of bringing currency to the economy, strong currency, dollars basically, into the economy to avoid balance of payment crisis, and also to make strong attachments, in terms, especially in technological links with foreign direct investments in the 80s, 90s, especially in 2000s, when we still had a strong number of conditionalities into investment, like the obligation to have a joint venture with Chinese firms, the geographical definition of position of that foreign investment, and certain quotas of amount of things that had to be exported that was linked with, let's say, the conditionalities that came with foreign direct investment, and which resulted in a big export boom for Chinese economy. But China has never been itself an export-led economy. It has always been especially after the 80s, a strong, amazing case of investment-led growth, right? And it's also not heading towards becoming a consumption-led economy, although consumption is going to have a growing pattern, a bigger impact in its national economy, more or less what they're calling now as the dual economy, right? Dual circulation economy, which emphasizes the importance of the domestic dynamics in growth. Nevertheless, we're not watching China to become a consumption-led economy like the US basically is. What we are seeing is an economy that is moving from an investment-led to an innovation investment-led economy more and more, to make technology the main driver of investment, right? China nowadays has amazingly high rates of investments, around 44% of GDP, new fixed investments. That's more than twice of other economies, major economies, OECD's economies are investing, and more than other economy has ever invested in economic history on consistent terms, at least. We know that Japan has also very strong history, especially when it's in its catch-up ages, very strong emphasis on investment, very high levels of investment in its GDP, but because of the smaller size, especially in terms of the infrastructure that is meant to be built and all of that, investment had never reached such an amazing high level. That's what we see here from 78 into 2009. We look at investment as total capital formation goes always here around 40%, overcomes 40% around 2010, when it reached the peak of 48%. Now it's around 44%, right? And here we have net exports, which are once again extremely important for in terms of balance of payment equilibrium and in terms of technological change, but not in terms of growth, right? It's direct contribution to growth. So, how is this clash with the U.S. perceived from Chinese perspectives? I took here some pieces from either official talks or official documents. Minister Wang Yi recently said that China faces a power transition with the US at least since 2014. So we are supposed to see a world with much more instability and unpredictability. Also, they talk about a rapid iteration of US position that's linked with Trump election, then with the technological paradigm shift itself, with the Syria and migration crisis, the lack of global governance of climate change, trade war with China, internal domestic problems of China in the US, like Black Lives Matter, and problems to manage the COVID pandemics, and more recently with Afghanistan. On the other hand, China wants to present itself as offering international cooperation network, especially in terms of the vaccines. We saw that recently, in terms of free trade, governance, security, and peace, seeing a much more proactive role in multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization and the WTO. It also had rhetoric of non-conditionalities, win-win relations with other developing countries, and concrete measures in terms of broad free trade areas like the RC. Also, they also argued that until new values, norms, and rules are established, the world will face a long period of chaos and disorder. I quote here Yang Shuitong, also a realistic international theories from China. Before an international order with a strong Chinese influence, we will see an unstable order with intense disputes, and nuclear weapons can stop a world war, but protectionism, sanctions, political disruption, and crisis tend to grow. So under this scenario, right, how can we look at Xi Jinping's development model, development transition, and what is the big strategy behind in terms of either of development and of confrontation with the US? Well, we saw a strong shift in Chinese foreign policy after he took office from the so-called peaceful development discourse in terms of foreign policy. It went into a new area of Chinese power post-2014. Some people call it the wolf warrior foreign policy, right? Making reference to this Rambo version, Chinese Rambo version, right? This blockbuster. But what implies there that we have a much more assertive and much more aggressive China, either in terms of discourse or in terms of direct foreign policy. So the Chinese dream, the 中国梦 that Xi Jinping puts it, states that they're building a strong China that is now economically strong, politically, scientifically, and militarily. That's a radical change from official foreign policy that we had seen beginning with Deng Xiaoping's idea that they should keep a low profile as long as possible. Right? We have also seen China in very important and straight alliance with Russia, also with other few countries like Pakistan and Iran, of course, with an impact that is much more modest, and at the same time, a very aggressive counterpart from the US, advancing either with the Quad, this alliance between the USA and Japan, India, and Australia, or with more traditional and, well, as traditional as allies as the Philippines, South Korea, UK, New Zealand, and so forth, right? In that sense, we've seen recently these changes in the development model in this context of the dispute with the US. And the Chinese leadership seemed to be prioritizing structural reforms over short-term growth in order to achieve this technological leadership and hold on its own in a deepening rivalry with the US. So actually, what I'm arguing is that all of the big shocks that we have seen this year coming from Chinese economy are actually the result of government policies, interventions directly to promote structural change. So for instance, when we talk about Evergrande bankruptcy, it really followed changes in financial regulations over the real estate market that were introduced by Chinese leadership in October last year, like the 3 red lines that defined new limits for credit in order to avoid systemic risks, especially in the relation between the financial market and real estate sector. We also saw more ambitious climate changes and energy targets resulting into this escalating coal prices recently, and also resulting into the recent blackouts. The same we can say about the crackdown on Alibaba, Tencent, Meituan, and Didi, all the big internet platforms. This intense regulation on internet platforms data and its link with the financial market, with the financial capital, were actively promoted by the government, by the Chinese government. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. Also, we saw this new campaign against inequality that has carries this slogan of common prosperity, right? Having as a result the ending of the tutoring sector, the melting down of some billions of dollars with the end of these companies, and also the loss of political power of certain billionaires and pop star billionaires in China. So far, a new campaign that has much more a moral tonic related to fighting corruption and all of that, and not that many structural changes in terms of welfare benefits, of structural changes that would promote better income distribution or wealth distribution, but still a strong slogan that is being taken forward with also the intention to foster domestic support to the political power. And finally, last changes of the last months, we saw more and more promotion of conservative family values and nationalism. It has also led to greater control over, for instance, queer community. Also, in this case, intensifying the control over internet and other individual rights. And other individual rights. So in terms of the regulatory crackdown, what we see clearly is that some of the goals of this regulatory tightening, we see the leadership in we see China searching for leadership in disruptive technologies of the next industrial revolution, control of data, cybersecurity, and restrictions on foreign capital penetration here, trying to avoid the growing of nebulous financial instrument. So basically what we see is Beijing trying to avoid technological and education sectors that are too much dependent on US IPOs and other financial vehicles such as variable interest entities that grew extremely fast on the basis of other internet platforms. These sectors, they also represent strategic vulnerabilities in the middle of a fast-growing cyber and data control war. So Beijing wants investors putting basically their money into high-tech manufacturing companies over online services companies. So it's not a crackdown on big techs in general, as we see that they continue to favor high-tech manufacturing sectors, but specifically on internet service platforms, trying to curb their connections with international financial markets, trying to curb their control over data, and trying to discipline their scope in this new technological revolution. In that sense, when we talk about changes in the development model, it means we can sort of summarize that China is shifting from an economy driven by investment in infrastructure that we saw in the past decades to an economy that is driven by investment in innovation. That's what people are generally saying, a transition from quantitative to more qualitative growth, right? We won't see anymore this huge growth rates, but we will see a change to a more qualitative growth. It does not mean reducing the role of investment. You continue to see investment guiding growth, but it means that elasticities, they can change, especially that has a lot of impacts for demands of natural resources and coming from Latin America, for instance. It also means that the national developmental model of China reaffirms itself, right? It goes into a new stage, now focusing much more on this qualitative growth, but it's still reaffirming itself and reinventing itself. China also wants to avoid the so-called three mistakes of the US, and therefore it's strengthening its control of the economy. That means it wants to avoid disindustrialization. It wants to avoid growing unlimited inequalities, and it wants to avoid financialization of its economy, right? Especially the links of the national financial market with international financial markets. So my short conclusions here. The current war is not a Cold or a commercial war, but a war for technological domination. We see Xi's long-term goals are driven by its vision of national greatness and intensify rivalry with the US. Risks are still very relevant and mean that they have all under control. Growth will for sure slow down, as real estate sector represents now from 15 to 20% of GDP, and there is no equivalent replacement for it right now. Right? But there is a long-term bet there. China sees the opportunity presented by the new technological revolution and is advancing on its national developmental model, turning it into an innovation-driven growth. China's response to this technological revolution and the energy transition are closely tied to its strategy of becoming a major economic and political superpower. So I thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to listen to you all and for questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nogueira, for such a rich presentation. Once again, we would like to encourage the audience to send their questions through the Slido platform. And without further ado, I introduce our commentator of the night, Dr. Ken Jimbo, professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University in Tokyo. He is currently a senior research fellow at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies and also at the Tokyo Foundation. Dr. Jimbo has served as special advisor to the Japanese Ministry of Defense, as well as senior advisor at the National Security Secretariat of Japan. His policy writings have appeared in publishers such as the RAND Corporation, CSIS, Japan Times, Nikkei, and others. Dr. Jimbo, good morning, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much once again to FGB kindly inviting me to this seminar. I had a great pleasure offering my talk 2 weeks ago, and this time I had a more pleasure to be as a commentator for the wonderful speech made by Dr. Isabela Nogueira. And I guess that her presentation basically focused on the new model of the development in the Chinese industrial policy, economic policy. But I think that, that China is always the subject for everyone, but with her expertise and deep knowledge about the Chinese political economy, I think the presentation made a great contribution to how to seize the trends of where China is going, and especially by contrasting to the macro trends, what has been happening in the distribution of power, the nature of the US-China competition, and then to focus deeply on the economic policy that China has now been facing. So it's a great pleasure to listening to your initial remark, and then I'll be making some comments and questions for the further discussion. And so, the points I liked about your presentations are numerous, but let me point it out a few. First of all, the Professor Nogueira started by showing us the macro picture of what's been happening in the structural sense in the world affairs, global trends framing. And I really like to know, she tried to argue that framing of the confrontation is not like a new Cold War, but that is the confrontation between powers rather than the blocks. So when we try to talk about, to frame that the United States is trying to, obviously trying to have the coalition among the like-minded states, and they are trying to, focus on lots of like supply chain reviews or tech alliance in order to get those kind of a coalition among those members, mainly among those democracy. And obviously there's a China that has its own economic model, and through the BRI projects, there has been also the expansion of the China-led ecosystem in the region wide. But I think it's always important to do not overlook what has been happening in between the United States and China. As Dr. Isabela correctly mentioned, that's a huge amount of capital flows and investments and lots of interdependency on the US-China economy still stays. So that it is not about, two blocks are competing with each other, but there's have been the generation, generating of the trends that those kind of groupings seems to be on the trends of forming, but at the core there is a U.S.-China transaction. So these are, I think, a very important, framing when we look at the U.S.-China competition as of today. And also, I was also reminded the very important points that Dr. Isabela made about Chinese development paradigms. And I was reminded that back in 1995, I guess, the Nobel Prize winner, Paul Krugman, wrote the famous article called The Myth of Asian Miracle, and where he was very skeptical about the continuity of the Asian growth. According to him, that he utilized the total factor productivity, and then the Asian economy is heavily relying on the inputs, on the capital and the labor. And when you look at the industry, those are the labor-intensive manufacturing and export-led economy. So that without the proper investment towards the tech revolution, technological reforms, internal reform of the those industrial structure, Asian economy, especially led by those China at the center, that will sooner or later will face with the structural conundrum. And the Asian financial crisis in 1997, really hits the mind of the Paul Krugman, and he always said, "I told you so." That's what's happening. But what really happened, since 21st century and onwards, is obviously that the China has gone through a great kind of another great developments trends, and by looking at those, the trends and why it was possible. And I was very, enlightened to see that is not really, the Chinese traditional model has never been the export-led economy, and it is not really trying to frame that the China is transitioning from the export-led economy to the consumption-led economy, but it is the investment-led economy to the innovation-led economy. And through those kind of framing processes, I think we had a better understanding of the structural kind of reality of the Chinese economy and what is at stake, and what has been the kind of, the long-standing trend to sustain the Chinese growth, and why those digital revolution can be possible in the Chinese context. So in that sense, that I think there was a very great contribution to see those issues. But I think Dr. Isabela has also been acutely aware that those model has a lot of the structural problems which Chinese leaders and those corporate groups have been facing very seriously, and I think those evergreen financial crisis, a real estate crisis has been one of them. But I think that that will also trigger more like a deeper structural issue that Chinese have been trying to tackle with. So let me try to raise some of my question after listening to your excellent presentation. First of all, it is about the center of your remark is on the new Chinese development model, and that is basically led by the innovation led economy, and I do agree, and I think that has been one of the most important pillar of how China try to transform its economy in past decade, and that really created very innovative tech giants like Alibaba, Tencent, and all the others, and that really tried to transform not only those technological area, but also be spread out in the people's daily life. I vividly remember that I visited Dalian 5 years ago, for example, and then attended the summer Davos meeting. And I had my friend, I had my former students who decided to go to Dalian to become an exchange student there. And I asked her whether we should have a lunch together. And then I'll try to serve her a lunch. And I told her that I'm sorry that I haven't really exchanged the Japanese yen to renminbi. So may I use my credit card? And she responded me Professor Jimbo, are you still using a credit card, and are you still trying to search for the exchange place? There's nothing like that in China anymore. And we're using QR code and I don't even carry my wallet. And actually that there's a QR code everywhere, even 5 years ago. Now it's really normal to understand what happened, but it was very shocking to see walking around the place in Dalian. Everywhere was the QR code. Even the street vendor and those are having a printout QR code by herself and changing a kind of B2C, C2C, any kind of person-to-person financial exchanges are already embedded in deeper sense of the Chinese economy. So I think a revolution was real, and it's deeply apprehended by Chinese people and Chinese society, and that really led that those kind of innovation-driven economic reform has been taking place for some time and deeply embedded in China. So I was really struck to see those changes even 5 years ago. But I guess my question here is that how much does Dr. Isabela thinks that those direction of the Chinese economy has been creating the consensus among the leaders in China? Because there has been some the back and forth directions that I heard from the policy circles in China over how they should run the economy, because obviously the dual circulation has been the benchmark of its policy. So obviously the investment, consumption kind of the circulation has been led. But when we try to see that whether you are encouraging the tech giants to provide more services and investment in China and overseas, but at the same time, there has been a huge kind of regulation and crackdowns towards those tech people there. And also, as for the distribution policy, there has been a keywords called the common prosperity. So, which means that President Xi Jinping and CCP leaders obviously try to take into account of the distribution of the Chinese wealth, and that will require more public spending towards the social welfare and the subsidies, not only for the innovation and investment, but also for those distribution purposes. So I guess when you try to focus on the innovation-led economy, but at the same time that China really faces the very traditional distribution process, it's on the economy. And obviously that will be a huge weight on how much that the China needs to really face with those two kind of economic major trends that they need to face. So I would like to know your point about this, how China can really make a balance between those innovation-based economy versus those distribution policies. And secondly, I remember you asked me about the Chinese application of TPP. And I also like to come back to this point, how you think about it. And TPP obviously requires China to take a drastic reform policy at home. And when we think about Vietnam's application to the TPP, and Vietnam is also the socialist-led, governance that has a strong regulation over the corporate activities inside Vietnam, and also that applies to the foreign direct investments, joint ventures, and so on. The similar problem that Vietnam had encountered in application process of the TPP. And as far as I know, that they have reformed like hundreds of the domestic law in order to be part of the TPP to try to meet the criteria. And whether China is ready to seriously pursue such kind of domestic reform in accordance with the application standards to the TPP should be something that I really like to know. that comes into the bigger political question whether China is trying to lead the economic regional standardization policy in a mutually positive manner, or China is thinking about more tactical way to try to have a wedge between United States economic engagements, more like political economy engagement in the wider Indo-Pacific, and try to take a lead before United States try to make its own stance on the TPP, and it seems it's not going to happen anytime soon. So that China thought that it comes to be the great moment to try to reverse the kind of the leadership in the international institution making processes, and that's the the point one. And point two is that what's your view on Taiwan? Taiwan has also filed its own position on the TPP on the day after that China has made its official position on the application of the TPP. And that also creates lots of, another fundamental issues, how we should respond to this. And if you could if I could know your view about these, process dynamics, I'll be very happy. And my final question is something that you didn't really mention in your presentation, but I think when I think about the Chinese economy, that is also another important issue that is about renminbi and how the China thinks to develop its own digital currency, and what could be the strategy of cryptocurrency policy that the China wish to address to the international financial market. And everybody knows that Tencent, Alibaba already created the huge monetary platform for Chinese economy and transaction, not only among the businesses but also the personal platform, as I mentioned. But when it comes to those internationalization of those financial transactions, and I think they need to deal with lots of international monetary regulations, how to deal with the SWIFT system, and how to deal with the international monetary agreements. And the people think about, those transactions has to be monitored by financial, ministries in terms of preventing those, terrorists using the financial transactions and so on. So I think whenever China wishes to be a kind of responsible player in the international financial fields, I think China also needs to provide what could be the international standards for the renminbi as well. So I think that could also be an interesting point of discussion. And I would be grateful if I can get your view on this. So thank you very much. Those are my comments. And overall, I really enjoy your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jimbo. It is a wonderful pleasure to listen to you. It's very stimulating, very clarifying at the same time. So I thank you enormously for your comments, for your great comments, and for your difficult question as well. I'm afraid I cannot handle all of them, but I'll try to tackle some of these essential issues that you have raised. So your first two questions, so that they are linked, but I'll still treat them separately. The first one on big tax circle or big tax crackdown at the same time that they are trying to stimulate them. So it seems to be a huge contradiction there, because they are saying that the big tax, that we are going through an innovation-driven economy, but at the same time, they are putting a huge amount of regulation on them. Many of these companies are some of the major Chinese brands. When we think about Chinese brand, what do we think about? We think about Baidu, we think about Didi, we think about Alibaba, we think about Tencent, and these are exactly the very same brands or the very same big techs that regulators went directly into them. But I think it is very important to distinguish hard manufacturing and big techs that are, for instance, Huawei, for instance, ZTE, for instance, those who are concentrating into the manufacturing sector and those who are in the service sector. Because if we look, I don't have the data right here with me, but if you look at what's going on in the stock market, you will see that actually once all these internet platforms stocks have been going down, melting down, actually they lost about over 30% of their value, we will see that the same companies in the same period, the companies in the hardware sector, they are going up. And the government is clearly, to my understanding, the government is clearly signaling that they want people to put their money into the hardware sector. That the thing that they want to control and the things that they want to curb is first of all, the uncontrolled growth of internet platforms and all, including their financial links. Second, their intense and enormous control of data and all the strategic value that gets when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution. And third, their link with international capital. These are among the most financialized and internationalized companies in terms of finding very innovative financial ways to grow using all these creative financial instruments that, well, they've made fortunes using them. And we see a strong relation between the moments when either they were making their IPOs in the US or they were using new financial instruments and the moments that they received some type of punishment. So although when we look at the bigger picture, it seems that it's more or less an uncontrolled or a more general big tech crackdown. No, it's not on big tech generally. It's specifically on internet platforms, or especially those related to software. So the government's clearly trying to focus and trying to say the revolution is going to come from innovation, is going to come from the hardware sector. We have to focus in companies like Huawei, like ZTE, and so forth. So it doesn't mean that we won't face several challenges, or that the leadership won't face several challenges, especially because it's not clear what will be the political consequences of that in terms of how this private sector, this big private sector is going to respond in the middle and in the long term. It may bring some internal fragilities to this political economy. But so forth, the signs that they're given is that they will try to regulate and avoid risks that are related to data, that are financial, that are related to financial, and that is related in general to this broader uncontrolled business that are growing. Second, relating to your great question about the distribution policy and all this that is going through this slogan of the common prosperity, right? We've heard Bloomberg counted, I don't know, in the past 10 speeches made by Xi Jinping, they counted, I don't know, he mentioned common prosperity over 50 times or something like that. So common prosperity is everywhere now. We hear that all the time in China's speeches and so forth. But to me, it's still not clear what kind of social welfare they're going to concretely propose. It's not clear how it's going to shift fiscal policy. It's not clear how it's going to shift health sector. We know that China has strong problems in terms of health sector or even educational sector. It's highly unequal. Or how it's so far, to my understanding, to my reading, I might be totally wrong, but as far as I can see it, it has been much more a moral discourse than an effective way of changing income distribution in the country. We know that income distribution in China nowadays is much better than in the other BRICS countries, much better than Brazil, much better than India, much better than Russia, nothing to do with us. They have nothing to do, they're much better than we are in terms of wealth and income distribution. We also know that they are a little bit better than the US, but they are much worse than Japan, they're much worse than European countries and so forth. For a country that carries a socialist formal ideology, this is a big problem. How to be so unequal as that, how to carry this high level of inequality. And also it does have as well economic consequences, very high, we all know that, very high levels of inequalities. They make societies unstable, they make societies, the effective demand does not work properly. We start to have these problems of internal consumption and so forth. So they know they have to address that. And they know that they have somehow, both for political and for economic reasons, they have to address that. But to my reading, to my understanding so far, the signs of this common prosperity slogan are so far mostly moral signs in terms of fighting corruption, in terms of fighting these big billionaires and pop star billionaires and all of that. But we don't have concrete measures in terms of changes in fiscal policy, concrete measures in terms of new social welfare, what type of welfare state is coming and so far. But so I still want to wait a little bit more to see concrete measures coming from economic policy. And I think it's going to come after next year, once we have the Communist Party meeting next year. So after that, we're supposed to have a renewed period for Xi Jinping. So we're supposed to have concrete measures in terms of social welfare changes. About TTP, to be honest, I don't know. I was really asking you because I wanted your opinion on it. It's a big question that I really would like to understand better. To which extent is China really willing to make drastic reforms at home? Your question is great. Is China ready for that? Because it's clearly they need a regional pole, a regional balance there so that growth can continue. They depend on that. They depend, especially as rivalry with the US grows, they know that they need to integrate even more within Asia and to have a strong regional basis. So it seems to be the moment. So strategically, it would be the right moment to do that. But sincerely, Chinese leadership, they always surprise us. I have no idea to which extent it's just a way to try to enter TTP, but actually do not promote many radical changes and just make it more symbolic, or if there is really big willing to make a regional real integration. Actually, I would love to hear you again on that. And about the digital currency, that's also a wonderful question, because once these cryptocurrencies were created, they were supposed to be this type of anarchical currencies and all of that, right? But however, the proposal that is being put forward by Chinese leadership means that it would be issued by Chinese central bank. So that's radically different from what we know about cryptocurrencies so far. So that's totally different from what we know from cryptocurrencies so far. So once it's issued by Chinese central bank, that's another thing, that there's nothing anarchical there. There's nothing under that has no control there. And also, we still have to need more details on that, because so far what we have seen is that renminbi has been trying hard to internationalize, has been trying hard to increase its international use, but still nowadays, last time I saw the data, even for Chinese foreign trade, it was only 25% of Chinese foreign trade that was using renminbi. When we look at international trade, it's below 5%, it's 3%. So it depends if we use SWIFT or if we use other measures, but it's very international use of renminbi. It's still extremely low. So it really makes sense to try to shift, to try to promote a more structural change of the international monetary system, coming not only for the introduction of a new currency or new international currency, but through the introduction of new payment methods, of new structural innovations that would then be internationally commanded by China. Nevertheless, it's still not clear to me how that would be possible. And now I'm posing a question as a non-specialist in international financial systems, but it's still not clear to me how it would be possible to have a leading role in the international financial system using a digital currency and keeping capital controls, as China does nowadays. And we all know that capital controls and having a financial system that is mainly, banking system that is mainly state-owned is quite a pillar of Chinese development model so far. It has been so far a strong pillar of Chinese development model, which distinguished China radically from other economies. It's the only major economy in the world nowadays that has strong capital controls. So it has kept China with a very different profile in terms of financialization. I would say it has. China, some people don't agree with me, but I would say that China has not been a financialized country in international terms because of strong capital controls and strong presence of the state in the banking sector or financial sector in general. But in terms of the internationalization of a digital currency, they can do that at home, but to make that something that is internationally relevant, how they would do that, keeping such strong capital control. So it would imply a radical change, also another radical change in its pillar base of its development model. So, and in that sense, something that for at least the very short term, I don't know about the middle term and what would be the prospects for such type of change, but at least for the short term, they don't seem to be ready for that. There's too much happening, and the priority seems to be the technology leap. So I really would put some question marks in terms of that in the short terms, right? Or at least the capacity of these digital currencies to have some type of international impact. All right, thank you once again, Professor Jimbo, for your wonderful and very stimulating question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nogueira and Dr. Jimbo. We unfortunately don't have much time left, so I have merged a few of the questions we received related to China's development strategy and structural changes. So the question goes, I have actually sent it in our chat here on Zoom also. How do you think, Professor Isabela, China's development strategy will impact regions that have usually been American allies, such as Europe and Oceania? And how will the shift towards qualitative growth in China impact projects under the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, actually, in terms of, I'll start with the second question. In terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, we won't see radical changes of this qualitative growth there, because part of what China is now trying to ease domestically, which means the real sector, it's something that, and especially the links of this real sector with the financial sector, is something that it still has room to continue growing internationally. So I don't think that we will see a strong reduction of Chinese, well, actually Chinese investments have declined a little bit even before COVID, right? It was not because of COVID. Even before that, we saw as a sort of an accommodation of Chinese overseas investments. So, and that is something that, of course, after COVID even more, but that's a tendency that we might continue to see. But I don't think that we will see a radical decline of Chinese, let's say, infrastructure investment, traditional infrastructure investments in Belt and Road Initiative countries. Nevertheless, we can also, together or in parallel with these more traditional infrastructure investments in Belt and Road countries, countries affected by BRICS, we can also see a growing number of projects related to these cutting edge industries in which China is trying to lead. That means a lot of pressure to adopt 5G coming from Huawei, for instance, or new technologies coming from green sectors or wind power generation or solar panels and all of that. So we will also see more and more and a growing tendency of that, of Chinese companies trying to push this, either the technological patterns and the technological paradigms that they are developing and these cutting edge sectors in which they are trying to, let's say, define the technological paradigm. We can also see that happening in Brazil right now, actually, when, for instance, we see state grids investments here in the region. Some of it are related, or most of it are related to, I don't know how to say that in English, they're related to high ultra transmission lines, which is a technology that is basically now dominated by Chinese firms, and that connects and brings energy from Brazilian Amazon to our São Paulo and southeast here. So it's a very specific way of transmission of electric transmission from high ultra voltages, and it's part of this idea of China having leading firms in specific sectors in which it can dominate. And the more people using it, the more value it gets. And the second question was about how this strategy affects traditional American allies, such in Europe and in Oceania. It's going to change. Well, actually, the ways that we're rapidly seeing European and Australian relations with China changing are actually being guided more by geopolitics nowadays than by economy. We just saw a strong and close talk between the French president and Xi Jinping recently, as the French president was supposedly upset about being left behind in the Quad and so forth. So we see geopolitics also influencing very much China's Europe relations. But we will also see changes in China's demand, for instance, in iron ore and other items that will affect Australian economy, and they are already affecting Australian economy coming forward as elasticities of Chinese demands change, as it declines, its real sector share in the GDP declines, and all will start the growing demand of other sectors. So we'll have this both this two tier dimensions, one coming from geopolitics and other coming from changing patterns of Chinese demands affecting bilateral relations.
We would like to once again thank the professors for participating on the second opportunity for debate and exchange, as well as the Japan House for supporting the event and the audience for joining in. Next events are coming up with similar formats in the next weeks. So to everyone, thank you very much and have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hope to see you in person someday.
The same, yes.
Thank you very much.